Hello again, third graders. Our targets for today are: I will explain how the Iroquois adapted to their environment and how this environment contributed to their cultural identity, and I will describe some characteristics of the Iroquois culture. We're going to review some vocabulary that you will hear during the read aloud. Peace pipe. A peace pipe is a sacred pipe that was smoked as a ritual when tribes would negotiate war and peace. An example would be the chief of the Hopewell blew smoke from his peace pipe up to the gods. Longhouse. A longhouse is an Iroquois house made of wood and inhabited by various members of the clan, related to one another through their mother's side of the family. An example would be a typical longhouse was 150 feet long and was inhabited by as many as 50 people. Shamans. Shamans are people who are regarded as having access to spirits and are said to use magic to cure illnesses, tell the future, and control the spirits. An example would be when members of the tribe were sick, they sought help from the shamans. Wigwam. A wigwam is a dwelling of the eastern woodland Native Americans, which has a pole framework covered with mats, bark, or hides, and was either cone or dome shaped. An example would be a wigwam was a much smaller structure than a longhouse, used by just one family. What do we know? The Hopi tribe of the Southwest worshipped deities or spirit beings. They called these spirits Coatzinos. They believed the Coatzinos controlled every aspect of their world. They believed Coatzinos had the power to bring rain and cure the sick. The mound builders inhabited areas around the Mississippi River. The mound builders built giant mounds made of dirt in many different shapes and sizes. They built these mounds as burial places and to use as places for religious ceremonies. Where are we? While the mound builders were creating their own cultural identity near and around the Mississippi River, other Native Americans traveled to the northeast region of North America. In this region, there are woodlands and forests very different from the arid desert lands of the Southwest. Unlike the Southwest, there is no shortage of rainfall in the Northeast, and crops can grow without any real threat of drought. The people who settled here became known as the Eastern Woodland Indians. They were made up of numerous tribes, including the Iroquois, Mohican, and Powhatan. After listening to the read aloud, you will be asked to write a complete paragraph comparing and contrasting the cultures of the Iroquois and the Hopi people. You will be asked to include 3 supporting details and elaboration, with at least one way the cultures of the Iroquois and Hopi people are similar, and at least one way they are different. During the read aloud, you can pause the video at any time to take notes. You may also go back and re-listen to anything that you need. You will want to use a piece of lined paper to take notes as you listen. Set up your lined paper to take notes on the similarities and differences between the Iroquois culture and the Hopi culture. You may pause the video now to set up your note sheet. Purpose for listening. Listen to hear ways in which the cultures of the Iroquois in the Northeast and the Hopi in the Southwest are the same, and ways in which they are different. The journey for some native peoples took them to the northeastern part of America, to the abundant leafy woodlands and deep dark forests that stretched from Canada and the Great Lakes south to the Carolinas, and from the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast west to the Mississippi River. This was a time long before Europeans came and made their mark upon the land. This was a time when some native peoples made the forest their home and lived in long-term balance with their environment. Unlike in the Southwest, rain fell, as it still does, more frequently upon this land. The native peoples of the region did not believe there was a need to call upon the assistance of gods for rain to soak the earth and make the crops grow. And just as today in this region of the eastern woodlands, each season brought with it different climate and a changing earth. The same freshwater rivers and lakes, the same imposing mountains and forests, color the landscape today as they did back then. As you have already learned, some of the earliest people to settle across this region were the mound builders, whose culture lasted for thousands of years. They spread out from the Mississippi River and lived in the surrounding land, hunting in the forests and utilizing the abundant natural resources available to them. The people who settled in this area are known as the Eastern Woodland Indians. After hundreds of years of nomadic existence, other groups of people, bound by family connections, formed themselves into tribes. In fact, the eastern woodland Indians were made up of numerous tribes. Some of these tribes included the Iroquois, Mohican, and Powhatan. Over time, these tribes established their own cultural identities, which included a range of languages spoken throughout the large area. The eastern woodland Indians often interacted with each other. Sometimes their interactions were peaceful, at other times they were not. These tribes relied on the land for their very existence. They gathered their villages, their hunting lands, their crops, and their settlements from invasion by neighboring tribes. Some scientists believe that wars may have been the result of an era around 500 years ago to 1,000 years ago when the climate changed considerably. A harsh mini ice age swept across the world. This occurred thousands and thousands of years after many scientists think the Beringa crossing took place. During this time, when food was scarce and it was difficult to survive, tribal wars broke out and brought about the deaths of many young warriors and the destruction of tribal villages. Finally, in search of peace, these tribes joined together to form the Iroquois Nation, also called the Iroquois Confederacy. As they negotiated or discussed how they would live peacefully together, they often smoked peace pipes. As you have heard, the Iroquois did not call themselves by this name. They called themselves the Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse. The Iroquois people were actually 5 separate tribes: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Seneca, and the Cayuga, that inhabited a particular part of the eastern woodland region. They lived largely in what is now New York and Ohio. Once a year, sachems, or chiefs, from each tribe, who were always men but always chosen by women, would meet in a council to make new laws and deal with any new problems that arose. As with all native peoples, the landscape helped shape the Iroquois culture. It greatly influenced what kind of houses they built, what clothes they wore, what food they ate, how they traveled, what weapons they had, what tools they used, what gods they worshipped, and even what language they spoke. A typical home for many eastern woodland Indians depended on the climate and the available resources more than anything else. The 3 most familiar kinds of homes across the Northeast region were the longhouse, the wigwam, and a round-roofed clay and pole structure. Because the winter months were generally cold, with deep snow covering much of the ground, many eastern woodland Indians, including the Iroquois, constructed wigwams and longhouses. Wigwams were rounded structures that looked similar to wooden igloos and were homes in which individual families lived. The longhouse and wigwam were made almost entirely out of wood, different from the homes of the Hopi made out of wood and stone. In the colder regions of the north, especially around the Great Lakes, native peoples constructed wigwams that could easily be dismantled so tribes could, for part of the year, live a nomadic life. During this time of year, they followed the herds they hunted for their survival. To build a wigwam, young trees were cut down and bent over to form a rounded frame. Tree bark was placed over the frame. Grasses were then added to help insulate the home. A small hole in the roof allowed smoke from the fire inside the home to escape. The family cooked their food on an open fire and slept on mats. In the wintertime, they used animal furs to keep themselves warm. Longhouses were much larger than wigwams and were homes to several families that were related to each other. Just like the Hopi, the Iroquois considered themselves to be related to each other through the mothers in the tribe. This extended family group was called a clan. Each clan had an animal name. When a young couple married, they went to live with the bride's family. Some longhouses ranged in size from 50 feet to 150 feet long and housed as many as 50 people. To construct a longhouse, once again a frame was made using young trees. Bark was placed over the frame and was then sewn together. The longhouse had a large central hallway with rooms on either side. The family members slept on sleeping platforms. Some Iroquois still build longhouses today for ceremonies. Just like other tribes, the Iroquois made baskets and pots in which to store food. In some ways, an eastern woodlands longhouse would have been similar to a Viking longhouse, with a large extended family living inside of it. Because of the history of tribal war, the Iroquois built log walls all around their villages for safety. There could be several walls, but there was only one entranceway that could be swiftly sealed shut if needed. The Iroquois grew a variety of different corns, beans, and squash, just as the Hopis did. They cleared the land of trees and shrubs and planted their crops. Corn, bean, and squash were particularly important crops, and the Iroquois referred to them as the three sisters. Like members of the family, the three plants helped each other grow. While the Hopi planted their crops at the bottom of mesas to help them grow, the Iroquois relied on the natural relationship among these plants. The corn stalks provided a support for the bean plants, which would wind around the corn stalks. The squash leaves that lay on the ground prevented weeds and increased the amount of rainwater that was absorbed into the soil. Also, the bean plants produced a natural bacteria that made the soil more fertile for the corn and squash plants. Tobacco was smoked as part of ceremonial rituals and when promises were being made between tribes. The Iroquois and many other native people believed that the smoke carried prayers and promises up to the gods. Tobacco was also used to dress wounds and relieve toothaches. In the wintertime, when food was scarce, many Iroquois left their villages to hunt. They moved with the herds and often did not return to their villages until early spring. Unlike the Hopi, who ate very little meat, the Iroquois hunted deer regularly using bows and arrows. Young boys cloaked themselves in deerskin as they stealthily crept through the forest in pursuit of their prey. They also hunted smaller mammals, setting traps to catch them. In addition, the Iroquois fished and gathered berries, and tapped into trees to get maple syrup. Yes, the Iroquois had a sweet tooth, too. Like many other tribes, the Iroquois lived near water because water was a source of life. The Northeast has many more lakes, rivers, and streams than the hot, dry Southwest, so the Iroquois, unlike the Hopi, used water as a means of transportation. The Iroquois traveled in dugout canoes. They fished using nets and traps. Depending on the weather, the Iroquois wore a range of clothing. In the summer, the men wore a breechcloth, which was a short piece of buckskin. Women wore dresses of grass fibers. In the wintertime, everyone relied on animal furs to keep warm. Men also wore buckskin moccasins on their feet. This was different than the Hopi of the hot, arid Southwest, who wore cool cotton clothes for most of the year. They used dyes, beads, and quills to decorate their clothes, as well as their skin. Very important to the Iroquois was something called wampum. Wampum was an artistic way of communicating important thoughts and decisions. Wampum was belts and necklaces made of colored shells. The color and design of the beads could tell a story, or they could be used as a symbolic means of communication. Wampum could also be used when trading. It was therefore a kind of currency or money. Wampum was considered to be very valuable and was an important part of the Iroquois culture. The Iroquois, like many other eastern woodland Indians, believed in a spirit world that was governed by the Great Spirit. For the Iroquois, that Great Spirit was called Orenda. They also believed in an evil spirit, too. The Iroquois believed that everything had a spirit and that all living things on earth were connected. They believed that it was their responsibility to care for the earth. Each season brought with it special Iroquois ceremonies. While the Hopi had Cotsinos, the Iroquois had shamans or holy men. It was believed that the shamans could communicate with the spirit world. Shamans were thought to have special powers to do such things as cure the sick, bring about a good harvest, or bring victory to a tribe going to war. And so, the Iroquois, as well as other eastern woodland Indians, lived out their lives in this way. They told stories and celebrated their history. They worshipped the Great Spirit, and they lived in harmony with the land and all living creatures. Today, many Iroquois continue to follow and honor their traditional ways. Amazingly, some still build longhouses for ceremonies, and their leaders meet to guard and protect their ancient culture.